And here we are at the end, our very last week, the age of exploration. I like finishing EH101 at this point because it links in so clearly with lots of the other survey classes. If you want to go and do African Civ with Dr. Snyder, links in with the European first contacts with Africa. If you want to do South and Latin America with Dr. Soland, it also ties in with that. And if you want to do US 105, America until 1865, it also really ties in with that. So I overlap at this point with EH103 a little bit, but I like leaving off this at this point and not any other point for ending so-called early European civilization, because it is at this point that Europe takes its issues global. We could argue that the Black Death was a global phenomenon because it impacted Africa, Asia, and Europe, but no Americas. So the Americas are going to enter the scene this class, which is why I want to end here. The one, if you're like, that's still not the whole globe. Well, that's because the Europeans don't get to Australia until much later, well into the 18th century. So we can't even lob that on as an addendum without missing out, a couple of 100 years. So that's why I like to finish off EH101 with age exploration, because if you want to know more, there's so many different ways that you can learn more and other classes you can take. And everything up until this point has mainly been very Eurocentric, and particularly Western Europe. And we've talked occasionally about how they interacted with other cultures like Muslims, who were also in Europe, and the Crusades and the Black Death. But here it really is Europeans taking their nastiness global. What this time period is we are firmly in what historians call the early modern period. Now, our last 2 weeks, we were also kind of in the early modern period, because we did last week the Reformation and the week before we did the Renaissance. And certainly the Renaissance would say, we are not medieval, we are modern, we are, that's part of their ethos is being away from medieval. I think the Reformation, with the advent of new religious sects, is a massive break with the past. But with the Renaissance, we can argue, because it was an elite movement, did ordinary people really feel it? Whereas when we get to the age of exploration and even the Reformation, people are feeling it. Everybody's feeling it. So these are movements that affect all of society. So I think they're apt to be described as early modern. It is very hard to find a start date, therefore, for early modern. Let's say roughly 1450, although that depends from what standpoint you're in. I study late medieval Ireland. We definitely would not put our beginnings of the early modern period in 1450 in Ireland. So, but elsewhere, 1450, and certainly a lot of the events we're going to talk about today are 1450 or early 1500s. Right up until we'll call the Age of Revolution, so the American Revolution, French Revolution, Industrial Revolution, Agricultural Revolution, blah, 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 Revolution, at the end of the 18th century. That is what the early modern period. So there's lots of dates. One of the things, though, that does mark out the early modern being different is it's an era of exploration. Why? Why is it always associated with exploration? After all, medieval people did explore. Anybody who's taking my Crusades and Culture Contact class will tell you, oh yeah, medieval Europeans are very nosy. They're very nosy about what's going on outside the world. And, they make up these fantastical maps and drawings of what they think is out there, but they are really interested. But why is this a boom period? Well, historians have debated that, and I've only given you a few examples of why there is expansion associated with the early modern period. Number one, curiosity. That is an innate human condition. We are, as human beings, innately curious and asking why all the time. There's a reason why toddlers like to torment their parents by asking why. It is human nature at its most basic. And by the time we hit the early modern period, the Europeans had plenty of curiosity because their contacts with the Islamic world, the knowledge they got from the Islamic world, their experiences on crusade had only served to make them more curious. Another thing that contributes to their curiosity is a guy called Prester John. Prester John was a legendary ruler. It was learned at Rome in 1145 that a certain John, who called himself king and priest, reigning in the Indies, which is in the Middle Ages, the Indies is like anywhere they really wanted to be. And he wrote to the Pope in Rome and said, I'm going to come to the aid of your crusaders fighting in the Orient. So they all got very excited about that, as you might imagine. And then later, in 1177, Pope Alexander III received a message from a certain John, King of the Indies. And they thought, where's this come from? Maybe it's come from Ethiopia. Because medieval Europeans are obsessed with Ethiopia. They're pretty obsessed with the concept of there being Christians elsewhere in the world that they've lost contact with. And that is actually true. Ethiopia is a prime example of this. In the early days of Christianity, Jesus' disciples went off in missionary activities in every which direction. And, that stuff happened back in Europe. I don't need to tell you what stuff. You know all this stuff. And so, they lost contact with the missionary movements that went east, went south, went north, the directions that they lost contact. So they've a pretty good idea that there must be Christians elsewhere. They just don't know where they are. And Ethiopia in the northeast of Africa, up in the Horn of Africa, is one of those places. So they're like, oh my God, it must be the Christians in Ethiopia writing to us. Another letter appears from Prester John, King of the Indies, and it went to the Byzantine Emperor. This letter describes what power Prester John had. He says that he is reigning over the country converted by St. Thomas, who's one of these early disciples going out to convert people, and tells them about the marvels of his country. There were also versions in Hebrew as well as in Latin, and they made reference to the lost tribes of Israel. And so that became very famous, but we don't know anything really about its origins. What we do start to learn a bit more about who this Prester John character might have been came with the invasion of Persia by the Mongols. More information came that way. When the Europeans heard about these people coming from the east and defeating the Muslims in Persia, they got very excited. They thought, oh my goodness, it's King David. He's been offering to come and help us in all these letters. I mean, it's been too long for it to have been Prester John, but it must be his son acting on what in the letters that his father wrote. Who was this person coming and defeating them? None other than Genghis Khan. Now, I hope some of you are giggling now because, yes, with the benefit of hindsight, Genghis Khan not going to be the savior of Christianity at all. So they were excited and then bitterly disappointed. Throughout the 13th century, Europeans have been heading east in the hopes of identifying who this King of the Indies was that kept writing them letters. They knew he was a Christian king. Was he beaten by the Mongols? Was he from the same place as the three kings who visited Jesus as a baby are from? Is it China? Is it India? They're all very excited. There is some truth to this. They link it to Ethiopia sometimes, where they've lost contact with the Christian population there. They have lost contact with another Christian population in the east. These are Nestorians, Nestorian Christians. So missionaries early in the days of Christianity had gone east past what would then become the Muslim world and converted people to Christianity. And there are a large number of Nestorians who live within what we now call the Mongol Empire. So the West are like, it is exactly what they said, because look, the Mongol Empire has Christians. So the Indies is a very loose interpretation. Sometimes it's in the middle of Europe, sometimes, sorry, in the middle of Eurasia. Sometimes it's in China, India, Africa, Ethiopia. In fact, they really had high hopes of the Ethiopians because they kept coming across them in the Holy Lands. And they hoped that they would help them struggle with the Muslims who had their power base in Egypt. Nope. Lots of travellers tried to reach wherever Prester John was by way of India or Africa, and part of the motivation for the Portuguese sailing around Africa, which we're going to come to shortly, was because they hoped to reach Prester John. But by the time they hit the mid-15th century, they pretty sustained contact with the Ethiopians and had come to realise that Prester John wasn't real. Let's just stop with this nonsense altogether. And so nowadays, we still talk about Prester John, but within the context of one of history's greatest hoaxes, who Prester John, we're very confident, never existed. But somebody was smart enough to fake letters to the most powerful people in Europe in Hebrew and Latin and convince them that he was somewhere out there. This was a very intelligent person pulling a massive hoax on the medieval world. And we've never identified who it was. Personally, I think it must have been some incredibly bored, very well-educated monk or something who decided to write these letters. But a lot of early exploration attempts are explicitly to go and make contact with Prester John, with these Christian kingdoms, and the hope being that there'd be Christians on one side, Christians on the other, and between them they'd squeeze the Muslim world, like in a two-pronged attack, which of course never happened because Prester John was made up. Funny enough, this picture here that I put on the slide, you often see it attributed to being a European depiction of Prester John, but this is actually Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa was the emperor of the Malian Empire, and he was said to be the world's richest man. As you can see, he's got a gold crown, he's holding a gold orb, there is a person on a camel approaching him. He ruled Mali, and Mali had pretty much all the world's gold deposits at that time, so he controlled the trans-Saharan trade routes. He was Muslim, and the world got to know about Mansa Musa, the Malian Empire, and the huge amounts of money that they had when Mansa Musa pitched up to go on Hajj to Mecca, his pilgrimage as a Muslim, and appeared with, trains of thousands of people dripping in gold and camels and elephants and all these fantabulous creatures. So when the news spreads pretty quickly about Mansa Musa being on the other side of the Sahara in the Malian Empire. So again, they know Mansa Musa's there, he's Muslim, but hey, why can't there be a stinking rich Christian king on the other side either? So there's a lot of reasons by the time we're hitting the late Middle Ages of why Europeans are nosy about what's going on in the world around them. There's also economic motivations. Now, the Mongol Empire were, pretty terrifying at first. They cut down whoever opposed them. But when they settled down, they formed an empire that stretched all the way from China in the east, all the way to the Holy Lands in the west. And it was stable, and it was all ruled together. And what this means is stable for trade. And what trade ran through that area? The Silk Roads. So this means that the Mongol Empire provides amazing economic stability. It is a boom period for luxury goods being transported along the Silk Roads. Bad news, though, happening just before this age of exploration is that the Mongol Empire starts to break up. China expels all foreigners, and in 1453, the Ottoman Turks capture Constantinople. This means that the previously eastwards looking medieval world has the door slammed in its face. So many political changes happening all at the one time in favour of the Islamic world kind of just closes the door on their traditional routes to the east and all the luxury stuff they like. Another motivation, religious zeal. Many historians draw comparisons between this beginning of the period of exploration and the end of the Crusades. Western Europe has totally given up on the Crusades. The last few of them have been an absolute shambles. They have, however, been very successful in Spain. As we know, the Reconquista means that all the Muslims who were living in Spain were chucked out by the end of the 15th century. So they've been doing very well in the south of Europe, and then up in the northeast of Europe, they've had a series of crusades called the Northern Crusades up in the Baltic and in Russia. So this means that as far northeast as well into Russia is also Christianized. We know from last week too that what's going to happen at the beginning of the 16th century is a new period of religious war sparked by the Reformation. There is therefore a serious drive to convert across Europe. It already existed in the Middle Ages, but it also fuels the age of exploration. When we read the primary sources of the explorers as they set off on their journeys of discovery, they themselves state that they are going in search of new converts first and spices second. Now, in reality, swap those two around, but it still tells us how important religion was to them. Here's one of the most famous, and probably the most famous to all of you. He's not the first, though. Actually, it's the Portuguese who get the head start. They start to explore Africa and sailing around Africa, and in this they are sponsored by Prince Henry the Navigator in the 15th century. Prince Henry the Navigator had actually founded a special academy to train mariners. He was that keen on exploring the world. The first major exploration date comes from the Portuguese when Vasco da Gama rounds the Cape of Good Hope, the southernmost point of Africa, and is therefore able to sail onwards into the Indian Ocean and then onwards into India. Over time, they press on from India through to Asia and through to Malaysia. What they were looking for were spices. Now, spices are very small, they're very light, and they were incredibly expensive back at home. You can cram a lot of spices onto a boat back at this time period, and this means huge returns on investments for those who had invested in these Portuguese trips. And this fuels warfare, obviously. They're going to fight over control of these trade routes. They manage to wrest control of the spice trade in Asia from the Muslims, because there was already a massive Muslim trade network in the Indian Ocean. And so the Portuguese started to establish kind of a proto-empire in India and Asia. The Spanish, their next door neighbours, were also trying to capitalize on this vast profits available in the spice trade with Asia, but because the Portuguese had sewn up the route that goes around the southern tip of Africa, the Spanish thought, we need to find another way to get to the same end. Enter Christopher Columbus. He was not Spanish, he was actually Italian, he was from Genoa. Columbus's great idea, which he had been laughed out of many courts for before, he said that he'd done the mathematical equations and he thought that the circumference of the Earth was smaller than was previously thought, and Asia was bigger than everybody previously thought, which means that if you went westwards, it was not as far as people had previously presumed. He hadn't convinced many people of this, but he did manage to convince somebody this time, somebody super wealthy, super powerful, Queen Isabella of Spain. Which, at this point, I'd ask you, what were Columbus's ships and when did he travel? And you would all chorus, because you learned it in elementary school, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. He set sail on August the 3rd, 1492 with 90 men. He, on his first journey, reached the Bahamas in October, and then he explored Cuba and Hispaniola. When he returned to Spain, he announced, I found Asia, I was successful. Hey, after all, it's full of Indians. He gives the good news to the Spanish that not only is it going to be economically profitable because he's found Asia, but there's also plenty of pagans there ready and ripe to be converted to Catholicism. Because remember, this is the period of the Counter-Reformation. He made 3 subsequent voyages. He made this one in 1493. He made another one in 1498 and then another in 1502. He was in these later voyages trying to find a route to the Asian mainland. Obviously, he had no success because, you know, we're all sitting in the United States at the moment and we know there's 2 continents in the way. Because he knew that he had landed on islands. He knew that he hadn't landed on a great big landmass, but he believed that these were kind of islands somehow off the coast of Asia. And he thought if he get past these islands, he'll hit Asia properly. He believes that it is something to do with Asia. We know it's not. But other explorers capitalized on his discovery. John Cabot was the first Englishman, because, you know, it's Europe. They're competitive at the best of times. We know they're competitive, these kingdoms, at the best of times. And then we've got the extra added level of competition posed by the Reformations. So really, everybody in Europe wants to claim their own bit of this exploration. Heaven forfend another kingdom, let alone another religious sect, gets the edge on you. So the English head westwards too. They're going to try their hand at creating their own route. They're going to try the northern journey to China. Hey, guess what? You're not going to get to China by sailing northwards. Instead, they found Canada. Actually, they did not find anything that any European had not found before. It seems that they pitched up somewhere around Lanceau-Meadow, which is where our Vikings were many, many weeks ago. You might think, oh, the English did a really bad job. But what did they find? The Grand Banks. This was a huge fishing area. So the English were like, we didn't get to China, but we've got all the food. Sod your spices. We're going to eat fish till we burst. And of course, as we know, medieval people love their fish. More importantly, what language am I communicating with you in right now? English. John Cabot's actions gave the English a claim to America. Now, if we were in class, I would now ask you, does anyone know where the word America comes from? And somebody would know. Or they'd have noticed it was on this picture. Amerigo Vespucci. Going to end this video now, and you're going to go and watch a short movie clip. It's only about 3 minutes long, and it's going to explain to you the development of knowledge about the Americas, how America got its name. Now, it is one of these films on demand movies, so make sure you're logged into your library account so you can access it, or if not, just go via the library homepage and find it that way.